Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to the first IEHG Virtual Grand Rounds webinar of 2023. So we're kicking off the year with a fantastic topic and some fantastic speakers and panelists. So topic today is getting the balance right, empowering and improving health and well-being for Irish doctors. So we'll introduce the panelists first, and I suppose starting with distance from here, we have Prof Susan O'Boyle, who's coming in from Canberra, Australia, Senior Medical Advisor to the Health Workforce Division for the Australian Government Department of Health. We have Dr. Una Kennedy, a consultant in emergency medicine and the Irish Committee for Emergency Medicine Training Forum Wellbeing Committee Rep, ORCHEM, Royal College of Emergency Medicine Sustainable Work Practices Committee Irish Rep.
Dr. Colin Henry, we know well, Colin was an intern here on the matter and a geriatrician in Cork, is now the Chief Clinical Officer of the HSE. You're welcome, Colin. And we have Professor Gay Canan, who's Director of Health and Wellbeing in the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland. So an excellent panel for this important topic. The speakers, I think we're going to start today with Professor Ciaran O'Boyle, who's Director of the Centre for Positive Psychology and Health. And over to you, Tomas.
And then it'll be followed by Dr. Sean Casey, who's a Paediatric SpR and Chair of the Royal College of Physicians Health and Wellbeing Committee and Co-Chair of the National Health and Wellbeing Committee for Doctors in Ireland. So we will start, we'll have two 20-minute talks and then we'll have plenty of time for panel discussion afterwards. And feel free to enter into the questions and answers and chat as we speak. So we'll get Prof Ciaran O'Boyle to start.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much, Thomas. Let me get this this screen up, and here we go. Right, that's always the stress bit when you're doing this kind of thing. Nice to be here. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Tomas and Tim, for asking me along. Basically, I'm going to kind of set the scene a little bit, and Sean, I'm going to kind of drill down a little bit more. I've been interested in this area, health and well-being in the workplace, for nearly 40 years now. And this is the best quote I've come across in my time. It's from the painter, the artist Vincent van Gogh. He said, I put my heart and soul into my work and have lost my mind in the process. And I think that's the problem for us, certainly in healthcare. One puts one's heart and soul into one's work and then can end up, unfortunately, burnt out in the process. Now, right off the bat, I want to say this morning, I'm going to be talking about a number of strategies that individuals can use to improve their health and well-being. But for 40 years, I have thought that a lot of that, to be honest with you, is only the smaller part of the equation. So many of the stressors that occur in the workplace are such that individuals have little control over them. And individual approaches to stress management and burnout, they do have their place, but changing organizations has a much greater impact. And you know, it raises a philosophical and an ethical question. Why should we ask individuals to become more resilient to cope with an under-resourced or a badly managed organization? And that's a generic point that I'm making there. I've never really been a great fan of yoga at lunchtime. I don't have objections to yoga at lunchtime, but this isn't really all on the individual. A lot of this is about organizational change and organizational development. Now, having said that, let's look a little bit to see, are there things that individuals can do? And because of restrictions on time, I just direct you to our centre, the Centre for Positive Health Sciences and the RCSI. We have a lot of materials there, a lot of backup reading, a lot of resources. And I can make these slides available to Leslie if anybody is interested in them after the session. So we set up the Centre for Positive Health Sciences in RCSI because we've become very interested in the notion that whereas we're pretty good in healthcare, let me just get my laser up here. If we think about health in terms of a continuum from serious disease and illness on the left here, right through to positive health, or absolutely thriving or flourishing in physical, mental, social, perhaps spiritual well-being, meaning, and so on. Our healthcare system is pretty good down here, you know, in this area of pathogenesis, you know, symptoms, signs, disabilities, dealing with disease and so on. when you ask people what health means, most people say, well, it's not being sick. It's sort of here. It's this neutral point. But then that raises the question for us, what about all this stuff up here to the right? What about thriving and flourishing and being really, really in excellent health? What do we have to say about that in our medical and healthcare systems? And that's really what we're interested in. So with positive psychology, we're sort of looking at this well-being area that goes right across that whole spectrum. It's relevant for people who are ill, as well as for people who are, doing okay, but maybe languishing, as well as for people who are absolutely thriving. And I think you could argue lifestyle medicine, which is emerging now strongly as a new specialty, is really focused on, abating risk, yes, in terms of cardiovascular, non-communicable diseases and so on, but there's also an element of a focus on improving people towards the right of this equation. And it's there also that positive psychology as a scientific discipline is focused. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that health is a slippery concept. And I think we need to think about it more broadly in the round. So for us, there's two scientific foundations, really, two sciences that we're interested in. One is positive psychology, which is the scientific study. And that's important because once you get into this wellness space, there's a great deal of rubbish out there. So we stand on the research foundations. What's the evidence? We always ask, what's the evidence? Where's the research? So positive psychology is the scientific study of optimal human functioning. So we're right up on that right-hand side there, that aims to discover and promote the factors that allow individuals and communities and organizations to thrive, not just to get by, not just to be okay, but to actually thrive. That's what we're interested in. What can science tell us that helps us as individuals, organizations, societies, communities to really thrive? And it's based on the fundamental insight that treating mental illness is not the same as promoting mental health. Mental health is just not it doesn't mean just not being ill. It means something a lot more than that. So we're interested not just in the absence of the negative, but a whole range of other conditions: joy, serenity, courage, optimism, those kinds of characteristics. Now, because of time, we're not going to be able to go into this in detail. We've just published a book with Routledge. I'm not promoting it, I'm just saying it's there, where we've gone into the literature and pulled over 100 research-based positive psychology and lifestyle medicine tools that people can use. And in doing that, we've been careful to put in quite a large reference section. So anything that's in there, we have scientific evidence for. The second foundation for us, really, which is emerging like a train, is lifestyle medicine. This is Gary Egger's definition: the application of environmental, behavioral, medical, and motivational principles to the management of lifestyle-related health problems in a clinical setting, including self-care and management. Now, again, you will be much more expert on this than me, but WHO recently in a report estimated that 80% of non-communicable diseases can be prevented. So the kind of way of thinking is Aaron Antonovsky, the medical sociologist, the Israeli sociologist, said we're in the healthcare, we're like people at the end of a fast-flowing river, fishing people out and sorting them out, but we're not going up the river to see what's pushing them in the first place. And that's the kind of conceptualization behind lifestyle medicine. And you'll be aware of the pillars. For anybody interested in that, I would really recommend the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. And they have a board certification program for doctors and other health professionals. It's pretty sticky. I mean, there's a really good exam with it. This is the board review manual. The current president is Professor Beth Freitas from Harvard, who's a visiting professor with us in the center. So it's about a 9-month program with an exam, and people can become board certified in lifestyle medicine. I think it's a really excellent development. So to drill in a little bit, I'm going to just offer you three or four ideas that come from that way of thinking that people find helpful in terms of their well-being. I personally find these very helpful. I use this way of thinking myself. The first is the wonderful Carol Dweck's idea of mindset, that a great deal of our responses, our stress responses, are to the way we think about things, not to things. And Carol spent 50 years now in Stanford working on trying to elucidate these different ways of thinking. And she came up with this idea of mindset. And she distinguishes between two mindsets. One is a fixed mindset. So people who have fixed mindset think that their intelligence is static, that what they're born with is what they have. Their talents should carry them through. Effort shouldn't be required. Their desire is to look smart, and they'll avoid challenges that might make them look foolish. And they feel threatened by the success of others. Now, all of us have that to some degree. These aren't binary in that sense. People with a growth mindset, on the other hand, believe that their intelligence can be developed. The way they want to learn, they're not interested in looking smart, they're interested in learning. They'll embrace challenge because they feel that that's how they learn. They understand that effort is necessary and a part of the process. The talent doesn't carry you through to success. You need effort as well. They are open to learning from criticism. And if others are successful, they learn from that. Now, the real beauty of this, and it's fantastic, the research shows that we can shift from a fixed to a growth mindset. And what's really important is we can help children very early on. I've seen it in Australia in the schools. There are children 4 or 5 years of age being taught about growth mindsets. Young people know all about their vulnerabilities. This is a way of actually teaching them a different way of approaching this. And for any of you who have children or teenagers, I really would recommend Carl's book, Mindset. It's just a wonderful piece of work with a vast amount of very solid research behind it. So the journey to a growth mindset then is really about embracing challenges, persisting in the face of setbacks. And God knows anybody who is trained in medicine has done that. Seeing effort as part of the journey, learning from criticism, finding inspiration in the resilience of others. And then there's a very interesting idea. I'm showing you a report there from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine that was published in 2019 during COVID, where they showed research evidence to show that doctors and nurses who were less likely to burn out during COVID were those who tapped into their calling, that meaning, the higher purpose, what brought them into medicine and nursing in the first place. So what we're saying is there are ways for us to embrace a growth mindset that are helpful just in navigating the challenges, that are around us. The second key idea is this idea of learning and using meditation. Now, we're not going all religious or spiritual on this, just very basic attention management strategies. This is from a recent Scientific American. The data are amazing on the impact of regular meditation, increased gyrification in the cortex, anatomical changes in actual structures in the limbic system. So we're not just looking at changes in brain function, we're actually looking at changes in brain structure. Here's a lovely piece of work from the Max Planck Institute in 2017, teaching different kinds of meditation practices and showing anatomical and functional changes in brain function. Now, if you want to learn that, we've put a course together that my colleague Padraig Dunn developed for the ED department in St. James's, where ED consultants, nurses and so on did that. And there's lovely data to show the impact of this in a busy ED department. 10 minutes a day, that's all we're talking about. So we have a course up there. It's free. It's available to anybody who wants to just start thinking about this. We know the data, we know from the data, this is a really good strategy for helping with well-being. The third thing I want to talk about, and this is probably the most important thing, is every single person on this call, I reckon, knows what their weaknesses are. We've a lot of new research, very solid, good research to show that learning about our strengths, thinking more about our strengths and using our strengths more is a real pathway to improving well-being. And again, for any of you who have children or young people, get them to learn about their strengths. I'm directing you here to the wonderful VIA Institute of Character. It's in Cincinnati. We know the people there. We know the scientists. It's a philanthropic organization. They're putting all their research up there, published in really high impact journals. And they basically have spent about 15 years identifying the key strengths that humans have. This was a team of 50 scientists worked on this for 3 years. And here we have the kinds of strengths. There are 24 of them. They're in all societies, all communities. So you'll see here creativity, perseverance, fairness, leadership, humor, and so on. And they all break into these six values: wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. Now you can log on there. There's a very well validated questionnaire. It's 220 items. You do that, it's free, and you'll get back a rank ordering of your 24 strengths from 1 down to 24. And the research evidence shows that if we identify our top 5 or 6 strengths, you probably know what some of them are, but some of them might come as a surprise. If we start to use our strengths more in relationships and work and in leisure activities, if we choose work that lets us use our strengths, if we recraft our work to use our strengths more, and for those of us who are in management or leadership positions, if we can find out what the strengths of our people are, their individual strengths, and structure their work so they're playing to their strengths, their well-being rockets, and the whole nature, the culture of the team and the organization changes. I spoke about this last year to the Irish College of General Practitioners at their meeting. I think they crashed the site the following day. This is really, really good, a really good approach. So as you'll see, I'm not going down the stress burnout route here. I'm trying to sort of say, are there things that we can do to build our resilience where we take a more positive orientation, all the time understanding that we're operating with a milieu and an environment which is very challenging. And there's a whole set of arguments to be made about that as well. But here I'm just focusing in on the individual. The final thing I want to say, and this I have found is enormously helpful in my own life, is Stephen Covey's ideas about time management. I meet lots of people who go on time management courses and then never have the time to actually use what they learned on the time management course. And I think the principle is the problem, that we're going at it the wrong way. So in a nutshell, if you're not familiar with this, it's really, really worthwhile, I think, getting into it. So you all live extremely busy lives, and Covey makes a distinction between urgency, whether things are urgent or not urgent, and importance, whether things are important or not important. And quadrant 1 consists of things that are urgent and important. And you know, with thorax on take on a Saturday, it's important, it's urgent, it's got to be dealt with. So crisis, deadlines, meetings, problems, stuff that's in your face. Now, in healthcare, you know, people spend quite a lot of time in that quadrant. This quadrant is interesting, quadrant 3. This consists of things that are urgent but not important. And can I just ask you to think of your emails and your text messages and all the stuff that comes at us all the time in this busy world. But these are things, many of which, while seeming urgent, while they're in our faces, they're obvious, they're actually not important. They take an enormous amount of our time. The worst box to be in is quadrant 4, and that's things that are neither important nor urgent, right? You find yourself reading your junk mail, you're in quadrant 4. So most people, and many people on this call, will spend an awful lot of their time in quadrants 1 and 3 doing urgent stuff. And that is tiring. That is burnout territory. That is, you can keep that up for only a certain amount of time. Now, quadrant 1, a lot of that you can't do anything about because crises arise and you have to deal with them. There's a deadline and the results are important and so on. Quadrant 3, we can certainly seek to reduce. Now, the really important point to make from this is that effective people, and that means effective in their workplaces, in their lives, in their sense of well-being, spend at least some of their time in quadrant 2. And quadrant 2 consists of things that are important, but not urgent. And that's where a lot of self-help, self-care, the lifestyle medicine pillars that we talked about, exercise, diet, all that, they're all quadrant 2 kinds of things. So the lesson from this is we really have to shift some of our time into doing quadrant 2 things. In my case, I'll give you an example. When I was younger and I was doing presentations, I'd often be finishing the presentation just before I was introduced, doing it as a quadrant 1 thing, important, urgent, doing it right up to the line. I haven't done that for about 15 years since I learned that. I do it in advance now, where it's important but not urgent. And the impact of that is it reduces some of the quadrant 1 stuff, because there'll still be crisis, there'll still be things you have to do with, there'll still be some of that stuff, but some of it is now being planned for. And I think one of the great challenges at the moment in healthcare is that it is so difficult for professionals to find time to spend in quadrant 2. What we're doing this morning is a quadrant 2 activity. It's important, but it's not urgent. So we have to act on quadrant 2 things. Quadrants 1 and 3 act on us. So that's a really powerful way of thinking about time, where we think about it in terms not just of urgency, but also of importance. There's a quote from Goethe who said, "The enemy of the best is often the good." We can end up doing so many things, trying to run on the treadmill to keep up, that a lot of stuff gets lost along the way. So my final quote then, to summarize all of this: during COVID, I became really interested in the Stoic philosophers. And it's amazing how much they had to say 2,000 years ago. Marcus Aurelius, people like that, is relevant. Marcus Aurelius, as the emperor, dealt with a plague in Rome when he was emperor, as well as wars on his borders. And for any of you interested in this, the best bedside book that I know of is the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. He wrote notebooks to himself, which were kept after he died. But I'm going to finish with a quote from another Stoic philosopher. This was Epictetus, who was born in Phrygia as a slave, brought to Rome. His first master broke his leg to show him his power over him when he was a child. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, got his freedom aged 30, and set up one of the most important schools of philosophy in ancient Greece. And here's Epictetus over 2,000 years ago. Here's mindset. The chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices that I actually control. Where then do I look for good and evil? Not to the uncontrollable externals, but within myself to the choices that are my own. That's a mindset definition coming down to us from nearly 2,500 years ago. And the final point I want to make about this, that is not to say that we should stoically accept situations and environments that are unacceptable. We should seek to change them. But where it's difficult to do that or impossible to do that, a stoic mindset, I think, can be helpful. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop there and hand you over to Sean.
Okay. Thanks, Ciaran. That's excellent. It reminds me a bit, I suppose, of an Irish author, perhaps philosopher, would be Samuel Beckett, which is a lovely quote: was "Ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better." Which in some ways I think captures some of what you've told me. I might come to you back at you about resilience, because I'm quite interested in that. We're going to go on to our next speaker. We're going to put questions with the panel and to the two speakers at the end. That's okay. Over to you, Tomas.
Yeah, so Sean, if you can start your presentation now, that'd be fantastic. So as I said, Sean is the Paediatric SpR and chair of RCPI Health and Wellbeing Committee and co-chair of National Health and Wellbeing Committee. So thank you, Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Tomas, and thanks everyone in NDTP and Irish East Hospital Group for having me speak this morning. Thanks, Ciaran, as well. That was a really nice setup, really, for my talk, and a tough act to follow. So good morning, everyone. As Tomas mentioned, I'm a clinician myself. I'm a final year Peds SpR, so I'm down in it in the trenches with you. I've done a lot of work in health and wellbeing. I've been involved in health and wellbeing in the College of Physicians for too long now, really. It feels it's been maybe 6 years at this stage. And my talk today is on individual level strategies for managing well-being. So as Ciaran mentioned, organizational, national level changes are so important. They frame what the environment that we work in and what's expected of us and our colleagues. Our talk today is mostly focused on individual level strategies. I suppose they are easier to implement in the first instance, and it's something I can speak towards a bit more. But we do have on the a very strong group of panelists taking questions after this. So if you do have any questions around organizational level changes, we're happy to talk about that afterwards. I don't want anyone to take away from this talk that individual level strategies are the most important. It's just what I'm best positioned to talk about. So the title of my talk is "What Can I Do?" And I have a series of kind of icons in this title slide there that kind of illustrate themes I'm going to be exploring throughout the slides. So the first icon I had chosen there, and I preface all of my health and wellbeing talks with this image, is really about the canary in the coal mine. and that's that bird in the cage. So we as clinicians are the metaphorical canary in the coal mine. And I suppose at no point when the miners are digging and they notice that the canary has keeled over and died, do any of the miners say, oh, we need a more resilient canary, or oh, we need to go and train our canaries to be more resilient so that they can survive more arduous conditions, so that we can keep working without this nuisance of our canary being dead and us having to evacuate. That just wouldn't make sense. They heed the signs and they get out of there. And so that's why I want to caveat and preface all of my health and wellbeing talks and all of the strategies in this talk with is that the things I'm talking about in this talk are individual level strategies that only really work if you're at that top tier of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that's what this triangle shows. For anyone who hasn't come across it before, it's a simple concept. It's the hierarchy of needs that need to be met in order to achieve the highest tier, which is self-actualization. In order to get to that top tier, which is when you're working with kind of your most creative self, you're satisfied, everything is flowing through you and the productivity is good and the satisfaction is good. That's the ideal place to be, but in order to get there, you have to do it in a linear fashion, starting from the bottom up. So these strategies don't work if your physiological needs aren't met, and a lot of those due to organizational changes, but also changes we can make in our own lives. If you're not sleeping, if you haven't eaten, if you haven't had a chance for a break because you're over rostered, if your quality of life physiologically is not good because you're working out 1-4 rota, that kind of things, that's, these strategies won't work for you. And I fully recognize that. Safety is the next tier up, psychological safety and physical safety. If that need isn't met, then you can't get towards self-actualization. These strategies won't work for you. Love and belonging, both in work and outside of work, is the next tier up. That makes very logical sense. And then esteem, which is both esteem for ourselves and also esteem from and for our colleagues. And once all those criteria are met in that linear fashion, then you can hope to achieve self-actualization. And some of the strategies I'm talking about, they're evidence-based. They're also based on what my experience of what's gotten me through my years of training. They're very much tailored to what my experience is. And so in the Q&A afterwards, please do feel free to share any strategies that you find useful or things you want me to clarify on. But at no point do I want anyone to take away from this talk or ever to take away that, if you're struggling with your health and well-being, it's because you're not resilient enough or that the problem is you. If you take one thing from this talk, it's that if you got through medicine and you're in training and you're working in hospitals, by definition, you are resilient. You don't get there by accident. You don't get there by not being resilient. And so if the most resilient cohort of individuals who tend to be ending up in careers like medicine, if we're struggling with health and well-being, that's a sign that the environment we're working in is very difficult and that changes need to be made. And I fully recognize that and I fully experience that. And I don't want anyone to feel less than or made to feel less than because they've been told they're not resilient enough. And that's not the message we're sending today. It's not that just because you're not doing these things and you're struggling, it's on you. There's recognition of individual and organizational level changes that need to be made. In terms of what we can achieve, and one of the icons I've chosen about seeking a workflow, and this really kind of tailors back to my first journey in health and well-being in the workplace. I was on a J1 not too long ago, at this stage of the 2010 maybe in the States, and I was working in a summer camp with kids, and in that camp I noticed that they're adopting this FISH methodology that's got quite a good basis in educational psychology particularly. And the concept of FISH as a workplace psychology model is that there are 4 pillars, and they're listed on the image there on the left. One is about being present or being there. That's kind of living in the moment and enjoying every moment, and not being too worried or fixated on what happened in the past or what's going to happen in the future. Play at work or creativity at work is encouraged, making their day. That applies to your colleagues, but also your patient. That is about making every encounter count. And it's choosing your attitude, about very consciously choosing to bring the best version of yourself to every instance, every day. And the FISH methodology is interesting because it was adapted from a fish market in Seattle. An educational psychologist was traveling through the fish market, and he noticed that everyone there was really enthused and the atmosphere was really pleasant for the staff and for the customers. And he thought that was unusual because they're working, grossly speaking, minimum wage jobs. This was not the American dream. They're working with dead and dying fish. Why were these people so enthusiastic? And why was it so successful as a fish market, both in terms of financial turnover, but also in terms of employee and customer satisfaction? And he distilled those principles down into these 4 pillars I've mentioned. And then you have a picture of me on my J1 back in 2011, and I'm smiling, so it must have worked for me. But that was my first kind of exposure to health and well-being in the workplace. And it really did, set in framework for me as I was in college about what I'd expect from workplace standards. And as I started working through medicine, I started to notice that in the HSE and hospitals in general, there were differences in how these, pillars could be applied and should they be applied. And that kind of set me thinking on how we could work to change the environment we work in. I suppose what FISH is really about, the methodology, and what I think it's a theme that applies to everything in life. But if you love something enough, you don't have to like it all the time. And as Ciaran was saying, if you find your aptitude, the area you're good at, you don't have to like it all the time if you love it. So I Paediatric SpR, my interest in pediatric emergency medicine, and I love pediatric emergency medicine. I'm very lucky to just have found a job that I love. At 4 a.m, when it's bank holiday weekend, all my friends are out having fun, or else they're in bed asleep or doing fun activities, and I'm on call, and there's 25 patients to be seen with a 6-hour wait and an hour wait for triage. I don't like my job necessarily in that moment, but I love it enough that I stick with it. And if you love something enough, you don't have to like it all the time. And part of what the talk is today is about how you can engender that love, find what you love, and also grow to love your environment. And if you do, then you're in a very lucky place. So some of the strategies we can do around health and well-being, one's about being informed. I think it's kind of important. And I do hate to put the onus on people to do extra reading. I really do encourage everyone to work to live, try not to live to work. But if you do have time in between reading the articles that Ciaran mentioned, I just have listed 3 items here that I think should really form the core training and should be built into our training, almost like any other formal training task. So one is the National Study of Wellbeing of Hospital Doctors in Ireland. This was a research survey conducted in 2014 by RCPI and published in 2017. It frames a lot of what we do in the health and wellbeing sphere in the College of Physicians. It identified challenges, and now we're working on strategies to overcome those challenges. In the middle there, I've looking after your health and wellbeing guide. That was written by us actually in the Trainees Committee and the Health and Wellbeing Committee in RCPI. So it's written by doctors, by trainees specifically, for doctors. It's open access, and Leslie and the host of the meeting can post in the chat maybe the link to it. If you Google health and wellbeing booklet or RCPI, this comes up, and you don't have to be an RCPI member to read it. It's 44 pages. It's got a list of supports available for people, strategies for helping, a lot of the things Ciaran was talking about, and it really is a one-stop shop for a lot of health and wellbeing themes. And I really encourage people to engage with that. The last piece is, it's self-evident, our contract, but often as NCHEs, and I'm guilty of this, is we don't know our rights. So I'm not going to naively assume for a minute that, the contract is, number one, perfect, or that it is necessarily enforced in all sites. We know that's just not the case. But at the same point, if you know your rights, then you have some platform which to be able to contest things or to progress your rights. And if you don't, then you're just leaving yourself very vulnerable and exposed. And I'm just always struck by how when we go through our training, we're all taught things like in med school, you have to know the 13 different causes of pancreatitis and 15 different symptoms of acute coronary syndrome, but we don't know any strategies or supports that are designed for doctors. If someone's struggling with health and well-being, where can they go? And we also don't know any of the detail in our contract. And I just think that those should be core tenets of our training. At the moment, they're not. But so I suppose the onus on us to kind of go out and find these things. And in the meantime, the College of Physicians, what we're trying to do is build these into the curriculum. And I can talk about how we've done that after. So just one slide I have here is on infographics pulled from the health and wellbeing study I mentioned, because it frames like what we're trying to do in terms of working on health and wellbeing. So in the top left, you'll see that 7 out of 10 doctors love what they do and want to continue medicine, which is great. But just beneath that, you'll see that only half of doctors reported normal psychological well-being, which suggests that we really do love our jobs enough not to like it all the time. In the bottom left, you'll see 80% of doctors have low to no levels of physical activity. And that's something that, as Ciaran mentioned, is very closely linked to physical and mental health, and is something that we really must address and target. It's recognized that work in healthcare is kind of a knock, I suppose, to your life expectancy, partly because of the stress, but also because of the fact that you're working so much, it's hard to actually find time to prioritize physical activity. 4 out of 5 doctors report missing family or personal commitments because of work commitments. That makes sense, especially look at the top right, that the average working week at the time was 57 hours. I would hope that with European Working Time Directive implementation, that's improved somewhat since 2014. In many places, a lot of us work more than that. I know I've worked more than that. I suppose what I really want to emphasize with that is that hours worked is one piece, and European Working Time Directive is very important to implement, but content of hours worked is also important. So I worked, 24-hour shifts in quiet hospitals where it was very easy and I felt very, fine the next day. And I've worked 8-hour ED shifts where I was absolutely clapped out afterwards. And I suppose as content of hours work matters as much as hours worked. And so some of the work we're doing, at a national level in the college is trying to recognize that, and how do you mediate for things like mandatory rest breaks, access to food and things like that, to make sure that the hours you work are also allowing you to maintain health and well-being. The bottom right-hand quadrant then, 1 in 3 doctors suffer burnout, and that's a talk in itself. It's got very real knock-on effects for patients, for the individual, and also for the healthcare sector as a whole. And there's a lot of reading you can do about that and strategies to prevent it, individual level, organizational level. 4 to 5 doctors report working at a time when they're ill or injured, and definitely we've all been guilty of this. I think one of the surrogate benefits of COVID is that we all got quite good at actually taking appropriate sick leave and saying, no, I can't come in because I am sick now. And there are a lot of negative things that emerged from the pandemic, but I think one of them is that this culture of doctors having to turn up no matter what state you're in. Well, no, if you've got infectious symptoms of COVID, you couldn't go to work. And that's important because we need to have adequate staffing that we can allow for that situation, that not everyone can turn up every day. And presenteeism, which is the opposite of absenteeism, turning up to work when you shouldn't be turning up, that's presenteeism, is dangerous for the individual and for patients. And in the bottom, last infographic there is that 2 to 3 doctors report working at a time when they were, 2 to 3 doctors report that if they were suffering from psychological illness, that they wouldn't feel comfortable talking about it. That brings up the whole theme of self-stigma. And I think that's really important. It's something we've worked quite hard to peel back the layers on, because if you don't talk about it, then you can't improve it or address it. And so I found that was really powerful, hopefully with all the interventions we've done and all these talks, that can help to peel back the layers on that a bit. So in terms of other strategies people can do in order to improve health and well-being, one I found useful is about being targeted. So I think the image on the left there is really to capture this kind of late January, post New Year's resolution, post changeover piece where people have interviews coming up where you're just trying to take on everything. You're trying to improve your health and well-being, you're trying to improve your CV, you're trying to get interview experience, you're trying to juggle all kinds of responsibilities. And I think that if you have a more targeted approach, where you look at something like the Healthy Mind Platter, for example, it's got 7 pillars of wellness. If you just pick one of them and just try and improve it, say during the rotation. So during every rotation you get in the College of Physicians e-portfolio goals, and you work on them, an audit a QI project. If you make one of the goals a health and well-being goal, which is what I would love to see built into the training curricula, say improving your sleep time or improving physical activity, and just working on that one targeted goal and setting it like any other goal in the portfolio, you might meet it, or you might start it but not finish it, similar to your audits and QI projects, but you're working towards it, and just choosing one goal at a time can help rather than being inundated trying to do everything. Another piece we talk about a lot in health and wellbeing is about being civil, and I've got a slide here from Civility Saves Lives, which is run by an emergency medicine physician over in the UK, Chris Turner. And they've done a lot of evidence, and they've got a lot on there in terms of how civility, again, impacts upon the individual receiving it, but also has adverse impacts upon our ability to provide care and the patient experience and the experience for our colleagues. It's true that the environment we work in is very difficult at times, but we can do a certain amount to control that. But there's a certain amount of things that are outside of our control, like we're going to see sick people. That's the name we're in. That's the name of the game. If I'm in emergency medicine and resus and there's a sick kid, in the center of that is a very difficult situation, a sick, acutely unwell child. Around that is a lot of interactions with colleagues, which I can control. That's within my control sphere. And so I can dictate that. And that's one stress that we can mitigate against. And so they've shown there, for example, in this trial that they've published on their website, that surgeons or anesthetists who are exposed to a polite surgeon perform statistically significantly better than those exposed to a rude surgeon, which is very powerful. And also it shows on the far right that the anesthetists themselves didn't feel they performed any differently. And I would suggest that that's because we undervalue how much incivility has an impact upon our performance. And we've become quite accustomed to just, that's how they are, that's how the environment is, that's the language they speak in that specialty. And I think there's a lot we can do to address that. I have our civility in the workplace algorithm, which I've pulled from somewhere deep in the internet, and we've copied it into our health and wellbeing handbook. And it really is quite simple. I suppose at any point you have to assess, am I being a not nice person? And if you aren't, continue. And if you are, then please stop being a not nice person and reassess. And it just is something that has a very powerful effect upon the experience of ourselves, our colleagues, and our patients. Giving and receiving happiness is very powerful. So I think in healthcare, we are trained to be very deficit focused, a huge negativity bias. It's inherent in the human race. I mean, Prince Harry's book is selling because everyone loves a good, deficit focused story, but asset-based approaches can be very powerful too. So we're trained as doctors consciously to nurture this negativity bias, to spot the deficit, to spot the illness, and to look at a patient and see problems that we can solve. It's part of our training. And a lot of our formal reporting structures in healthcare are based around incident reports of what went wrong and how can we learn from that. And I would put that, and the evidence would suggest that we can learn as much from an asset-focused approach. What went well? How can we learn from that? How can we recognize that individual performed well? How can we tell them that to boost their morale and also to encourage them to do it again? And how can we extrapolate those learnings across the organization so that we can all learn, this person does that really well. Here's how we can all copy that and model that. The same way we do with incident reports. When something negative happens, we might do root cause analysis. We might do environmental and departmental teaching just to prevent it happening again. You can do the same with excellence performance in your organization. And the research has shown that 90 to 95% of what we do is good or excellent in work. And so if you're only capturing the 5% of the negative, or only basing your feedback at the end of rotations on what you're doing bad or what you can improve on, then you're really not capturing the whole of that person's performance. Now, the analogy there of sharks, if you're building a documentary on sharks and you wanted to capture the entirety of a shark's life, sharks spend the most of the time just chilling in the ocean, not bothering anyone. If you only based your documentary on shark attacks, you'd have a very poor representation of what sharks do in their life. And so it really is important to combine the asset-based and deficit approaches so that you can get a capture of the full picture and also incidentally improve well-being and morale. So this is an example of a creative initiative we introduced. So we're mandated as part of my training to do QI projects. And I feel that if I do it health and well-being themed, I get to be a bit creative in what I do. I get to enjoy what I do. As Ciaran mentioned, it gives me that purpose and that meaning. And I also tick a box in my CV. So it's kind of like working smart, not working hard. And this is an example of the Learning from Excellence initiative, which again is based on a model from the UK. They have a very good website. And we introduce these excellence reporting cards. If you scan this QR code, it brings you to a form. You fill in the form, and it is automated, so it sends to the individual, and they receive a validation of what they did that was excellent. And we try and make them as specific as possible. It's not just say you're a nice person. It's like you specifically did this, this, and this, and I liked it because of this. And that is a very powerful feedback mechanism. And it tells the individual, God, I should do that again. It also boosts their morale, particularly if you're post-call and you're always dwelling on the 2 patients you mismanaged. It's nice to say, oh, actually, I did something nice. I may not have even recognized it. And then our risk meetings, we'd actually sit down and we present incident reports, and we'd also present excellence reports, anonymized, and so that we can learn from all the excellence happening in our department. And there's a chance to be creative because actually staff members on the team, we had a team of collaborators across the department. They helped design the cards and the icons. The dolphin you see in ED was designed by one of the porters who's on our team for the excellence reporting. And it's a really fun chance to do things. So if you can do a health and wellbeing initiative as part of your training, I'd encourage you to do so. They can be fun, they can improve workplace wellbeing, and they can also, they can contribute to your CV, and they can be quite good on interviews, and they tend to travel quite well in conferences, quite topical at the moment. So in terms of them being the change you want to see, it's another purpose I want to talk about in terms of leadership. So whether you are a leader, whether you're working with leaders and becoming a leader, the way I see it, leadership is broken down into 2 simple strategies. It's warmth and strength, and it's a spectrum in between. So on the left-hand side, we're very warm SpongeBob, and on the right, we're very strong SpongeBob. And I think we all know leaders who are warm, and we all know leaders who are strong, and we know leaders who are warm but not strong, and leaders who are strong but not warm. And I think that the ideal spot is in between. You're warm enough that your staff feel psychologically safe to operate under you, and you're strong enough that people feel confident that you can lead them through this situation. And titrating your warmth and your strength is powerful. Often we gravitate just to the strong leaders, and I would encourage everyone to also seek out and learn from the warm leaders and channel your warmth, and know when in situations you need to be a little bit more warm and when in situations you need to be a little bit more strong, and being cognizant of that. In the last minute then, just talking about being heard. So here's some of the strategies that we've done, the Health and Wellbeing Commission, the College of Physicians, to try and improve health and wellbeing for our trainees. One is a BST course built on health and wellbeing. It's delivered by SPRs. So our SPRs get trained as faculty to learn about health and wellbeing, and they then deliver the course to the base specialist trainees. And that's a chance for the trainees, the base specialist trainees, to learn about health and wellbeing. and it's a very interactive virtual session with lots of workshops and things. And as an SPR, then it's a chance to not just improve your CV by getting education experience, you also, by virtue of becoming a faculty member, have to learn about health and well-being. So it's like a way to get people to engage with this topic in a meaningful way, and you get paid by the college to do it. So it's like a win-win, right? So that's a health and well-being course that we've built. It's been very positively received. We have a Doctors Parents Network, which is set up to support doctors as parents trying to juggle family life and personal life commitments. About 900 members now as a Facebook group, which is really good. And if you'd like to be a member of that, just Google Doctors Parents Network Ireland. A lot of supports posted by members to help each other. We've WellAble, which is for doctors in Ireland with chronic illness or disabilities, how to manage to get through training while also struggling with something, an exceptional factor. And lastly, just to say that under the Forum of Irish Postgraduate Training Medical Bodies, we have set up a cross training body health and wellbeing committee that seeks to kind of coordinate health and wellbeing activities across all the faculties and training bodies in Ireland, so that we're avoiding duplication but also promoting wellness. And I suppose that's my talk, and just say thanks to everyone for having me on this morning. I'm very happy to take any questions in the panel, and if you would like to contact me at any point to get involved in our committee or hear more about our activities, my email address is there and I can share it afterwards.
Go.
Thanks very much. Fantastic. Two very positive speakers, great people to work with. And this concept of sort of radiating that positivity, I think, is a very important message. You know, how we behave and how we speak really impacts on our colleagues and our patients. So we have an excellent panel, and we don't have much time, so we'll crack on. We have a couple of people representing the colleges, and we have a couple of people representing the system, if you like. So maybe we'll go to Canberra to Prof Susan Wearne, who works with the Health Work Division of the Australian government. And as so many of our Irish doctors are there right now and rotating through Australia, what's the secret there, or what have you learned? What are the strategies?
Susan, unmute yourself. Just the audience want to ask questions, put them in the chat box. We'll try and read them out. We'll try and make this interactive. Susan, over to you.
Thank you. I wish that we hadn't got the same problems of well-being not being brilliant. It's great that we have a reputation for good well-being. We do try to look after our doctors. But it is probably the #1 issue in our health system at the moment, well-being of all staff. We've recently been putting that into our national strategy for what we can do at the higher sort of policy level. I mean, I feel privileged to have been able to listen to the two speakers, and I'm feeling more encouraged and buoyant about my life as a result. But we've been looking at the Australian Health and Safety and Quality Commission standards and putting it into policy that doctor wellbeing and health service wellbeing matters. Similarly, working with the specialist medical colleges to make sure that doctor wellbeing is on their agenda. And also a couple of the states in Australia have now put it into law that hospital boards must consider how their workplaces are looking after their staff. So that's really at the macro high level as what we can do to improve the system.
Thanks, Susan. I might come to Dr. Colm Henry, if that's okay. Colm, Chief Clinical Officer at HSE. Any comments and thoughts? I must say I really enjoyed the talks. Thank you both. They're very thought-provoking, and thank you for those comments, Susan. Colm, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed the talks, and it's great to spend at least 1 hour this week on something that's important and not urgent. So, and if nothing else, we must all do more of that. So, just a couple of observations. When I look at people who worked around me and people I worked with, and then the delivery system, say the frontline workers during the pandemic, there was we suspended other kinds of medical care. We're now seeing a backlog of upgraded cancers, a backlog of upgraded mental health issues, a threefold increase in eating disorders coming to CAMHS clinics, delayed presentations of older people with malnutrition, reduced function. And I kind of see health and well-being in the workforce the same way. It was suspended during the pandemic because we all drove on adrenaline alone, and people were invigorated, and we all felt that sense of communality and being united, and it carried through into a vaccine program. But it also had the effect of deferring what were under structural issues in terms of our collective health and well-being. And that's very clear now that once the pandemic passed and there was no more adrenaline left, and we hit a crisis, for example, as we did in unscheduled care the past few weeks. I visited a hospital in Clonmel in Cork, in Dublin, and instead of seeing that kind of rallying unification we had during the pandemic, what I saw was exhaustion and depletion. There are measures administered called the Workforce Together, chaired by Anton O'Regan, which is looking at all those issues that were addressed by Sean, raised by Sean, and will look at it's not just a question of hours, it's a question of conditions, of how people are treated and valued, of their sense of purpose and where they're going with their training. And my hope is that between the work we have done on working hours and on improving quality of experience in the workplace, and this workforce that the minister put together under a very capable chair, it will lead to some degree of improvement. So in summary, Tim, we deferred this like we deferred other illness, and now we're dealing with the legacy.
I'm an optimist, and actually I give a compliment in relation to, I think Irish healthcare is quite good. In actual fact, it gets a bad press. We've got some great docs, nurses, and a lot of healthcare professions. We often give great care. And as Sean referred to there, with sort of giving and receiving happiness, there have been green roots of that and sprouts. In other ways, the programs the HSE were doing was designed for that you have a program. Let's say I was in neurology and we were trying to share knowledge and learning from across different sites of the country. What worked well somewhere you'd take elsewhere. And that was an important attempt to do the same. I would argue the hospital groups are the same, and there's been a significant uplift, I would say, to level 2 and level 3 hospitals, availing of some of the expertise perhaps at level 4. And that's the way we should be doing this, to lift it, you clustering hospitals, clustering communities and GPs, and sharing knowledge is key. Just like a last comment, I think absolutely being positive important. I was on the Matter board for a number of years, and there was always a report on complaints. And I, like a broken record, being stubborn, like good old Samuel Beckett, kept saying, can you give me a list of the compliments? And eventually they listed and they started to read out the letters of compliments. To the extent they've now renamed the officer the Compliments and Complaints Officer, appropriately so. We might go on to the other panelists. Any other, Sean, over to you, Tomas.
Yeah, maybe Una Kennedy, my colleague, consultant in emergency medicine, James, is representing the college, the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. They look at sustainable work practices, and the Irish Committee for Emergency Medicine Training. Maybe just a comment on what the college is doing, and maybe we'll get the same from Gay Canan afterwards.
Yeah, certainly from thanks, and two really fantastic talks, Ciaran and Sean, and so much of it resonates and that I can relate to. I suppose coming from the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, we have a wellbeing app that we have designed. We've co-designed with a partner in the UK, and we've over 11,000 members using that content on a regular basis. And we get feedback then from the external company about our workforce. And using Ciaran's strengths-based approach, what do we know about our workforce? We know that they have they absolutely take a lot of pride and derive a lot of meaning from their work. They're adaptable, they're very curious, they have a love of learning, they've high degrees of emotional support. And I suppose they're the positives that we know about our workforce. And certainly with Sean's infographic, I think that the same across the Irish trainees who were surveyed in that RCPI survey that he reported back. But I guess then if you look at where do we need to improve, and we know that energy and fatigue is an issue, and so doing education around sleep hygiene, about basic lifestyle medicine pillars that Ciaran mentioned, and we know that we've got low focus and attention scores, and and issues with emotional support, and so meditation is something else that we're pushing from the college. I suppose coming back to St. James's and to Dublin, we have just this week very proudly just appointed our first SpR fellow in physician wellbeing in emergency medicine. So to my knowledge, this is only the second such fellowship in the world. So the first one is in Stanford, and they've been world leaders. You'll see now, and there's a movement certainly in the US hospitals. And Susan, I know in Sydney there's a chief wellness officer in in Sydney as well, in one of the hospitals. And I think this is where we're going to have to go, certainly in Stanford, Hopkins, and Mass General in the big centers in the US. They have a chief wellness officer who is at executive level in the hospital and has responsibility for staff well-being. And the Stanford model that they use of professional fulfillment, it's not, personal resilience is only one part of it. And then the other part is the culture of wellness, and that's a responsibility from top-down leadership in the organization. And also the third one being efficiency of practice, so support around communication, duplication of workload, IT support, and that. And I'm so inspired by that model, and that's certainly what we're hoping to work with our new fellow when he starts in the summer. So lots of exciting things happening here, and lots of great. There's excellent pockets of work happening around the country, and it's great to have a call like this where we can, get heads together and really take the best of what's happening and start to collaborate in this really important area.
Thanks, Ina, that's fantastic. And Prof Ciaran, from the RCPI perspective.
Hi, thanks a million. What a great conference, really enjoyed it. There were so many aspects that were covered and wonderful talks by Ciaran and Sean, and also enjoyed the comments. I suppose because time is limited, the one thing I'd just like to emphasize that was already mentioned by Sean and Ciaran is that whole sense of purpose, that, there's a lot we can't change, a better environment, there's a lot that we can. But, I think a lot of us tend to identify very much with being a doctor. That's how we describe ourselves. But what else are we? Are we writers? Are we hockey players? Are we husbands, wives, best friends, etc.? And I think, listing I really agree with listing the sense of strengths, but also strongly identifying with who else we are and expanding that kind of holistic approach that we advocate for patients, but actually expanding it to ourselves as well.
Thank you, Prof Ciaran. We just have one question, and it's a long one, so bear with me, from Ronan Canavan. What strategies should one use to impact on an organisation that a spend of 40,000 to save 4 million achieved through admission avoidance, or don't recognise not recruiting 9 out of 9 posts, that these are risk to patients? When these scenarios are increasing the case, should you protect oneself from how that makes you feel, or continue to return trying to influence the organization? So this is a question, I guess, about the system we work in.
So the usual tension we have, isn't it, that you recognize we're under-sourced and under certain areas, and there's a risk both to yourself but also the patient, and then how do you keep influencing the organization? And I'd be interested in comments to the group. My approach has always been, I suppose, I've tried to remain involved with the organization, recognizing my weaknesses, as Ciaran had it earlier. I'm sure sometimes I do find a bit like Mr. Angry in Inside Out, when the top of his head blows, if you remember, and sometimes I find myself in that scenario, and I try and delay it, but I try and keep remaining engaged with it and trying to influence the organization. But depends on the scenario, clearly. If it gets to the stage that you think it's really unsafe and on not a good scenario for the patients or yourself, then sometimes, well, enough is enough. And I've done that. I've just said, okay, I can't engage any further. I'm stopping here, and I've withdrawn at that stage. And that results in a change in organization. Any other comments or other thoughts with the panel with regard to that question? It's a complex one. It's a difficult tension. We all have it ongoing in our career. Overall, I must say most of the time I try and stay engaged, but there is a time sometimes when the line does get crossed.
Yeah, we run still, when I was still in the Institute of Leadership, we run the training program for clinical directors. And it's a very interesting spot that people get squeezed in there when they take on, the consultant takes on that role, is they are caught very often in the headlights, but they have a lot of, very often they have a lot of responsibility, but not a great deal of authority, you know. So I think that really comes down to a whole question of the culture in the organizations and how leadership and management works in the organizations. But I think the evidence, the research evidence, is that when clinicians are involved in the management of hospitals in particular, the outcomes are better. So while I think there's challenging and it's difficult, I think it's really important that clinicians are involved in the management of hospitals and healthcare.
Okay, thank you. We have hands up from Sean first, and then Susan.
Yeah, and thanks to Moss and thanks to the whoever posed the question. I hope I'm answering it correctly, but I think what Ciaran was getting at there as well, to echo that, everyone has a voice, and I think that data drives change. Very often, speaking from a trainee perspective, we're allocated to roles for 3 month to 6 months periods, and often the environment we work in is very inhospitable. Ironically, working in hospital. And I think that very often the mindset is, this is my problem for 3 months, and it's, you know, long-term not sustainable, but it's only for me to put up with for 3 months, and I'll move on, and I'll never speak about it at my end of year assessments. I won't report it. That'll cause problems for me progressing my career, and I'll just pass the problem on to someone else. And the organization doesn't need to change, because it works perfectly for the organization. It gets people in, you do 3 months, you do 6 months jobs, then you rotate on to the next one, and it becomes someone else's problem. And I do think that everyone has a voice, and your voice does matter. And I would encourage everyone to use that voice. I think data drives change. If we can recognize the need for patient care, but also recognize the need to look after ourselves, we need to be capturing things like, you know, what was your genuine experience of that rotation? Let the college know if you're having difficulties. It needs to be fed back. And it doesn't always mean limitations to progressing your career. There are ways of going about it that can be quite positive. And then in interviews, you can say, look, I worked in this environment and it was toxic, and here's how I contributed to changing that from a managerial perspective. But it does, you know, I think there's a 2 hit there, where you're working in hospitable conditions, and you also have a hit from thinking that your voice doesn't matter, that there's nothing you can do to change it. It's very disempowering. And just to empower people to try and engage with it, like we've done in the college, and the limited outputs we've had have had some impact for someone, the BST course, things like that. It's affected it in some positive way. So just do try and get involved, and try and avoid the cynical, I'll just leave it, it's broken, it's never going to be fixed. Because if you can capture data through reports, then data can hope to drive change. That would be my piece on it.
Fantastic.
Susan?
As a junior doctor, I was the one that went and sat at the executive's outside his office, because he was refusing to get a replacement. And I was told only he could make the decision, so I went. And I think that attitude is still the same, politely, kindly, but just said, I can't do any more. And I think in healthcare, we probably are getting to that stage where there's limits, and we're actually going to have to start making big decisions about what is urgent and what is affordable, and what is important and still needs to go ahead, and what are the interventions that actually are in box 3 and 4 that and we need to have honest discussions with our leaders, with politicians, with patients, that not everything that has been available is now going to be in the future, because we're all stretched.
Thank you, Susan. Ciaran?
Just very briefly, I want to come back to something Gay said that I think is incredibly important about identity being broader than being, you know, a doctor. We need to do a lot more in the medical schools to make sure that our medical students hold on to all of the interests, hobbies, you know, music, literature that they bring in. We're not very good at that in the medical schools, you know. That's the first thing I'd say. Second thing is, there's a super piece of work by Peter Gillam in RCSI, where he interviewed, I think it's about 390 consultants in their 50s, and asked them, what's the piece of advice you'd give to your 20-year-old self? Super idea. By a mile, by 60%, the piece of advice they would give to their 60-year-old selves was, look after your work-life balance.
Thank you.
You know, I think what Gay is saying there is absolutely critical. We've got a committee now in RCSI helping surgeons to think about what life will be after retiring from surgery. I'm sitting on it, and it's a great case study, I have to say, in, you know, putting all the eggs in one basket in terms of identity. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ciaran. That's a very important message from the 50-year-old to the 20-year-old self. So I think that will probably come to the time there. There was a question about examples, resources, best practice for staff recognition. I think we will, this talk will be going up online, and we'll circulate a link to it, and we may have links to resources and extra stuff. It's a very big topic. So it's great that we managed to get, you know, what we we set out to do for today, for the last hour. So thank you.
Thank you all, excellent speakers. Thank you, panelists and the audience.